The Monday evening Vespers at St. Mildred's had never been an event of gripping drama, even by the modest standards of Flaxborough. Its chief purpose, beyond satisfying the vicar's timetable of ecclesiastical duties, was to offer parishioners a respectable reason to leave their homes without risking the charge of frivolity. It was therefore with a degree of communal confusion, mild but noticeable, that a missing confession slip should disturb the serenity of that particular service. Inspector Purbright, though no great admirer of churchly ceremony, found himself summoned by a message described as urgent only in a theological sense. The vicar, Reverend Estel, stood in the nave with the air of a man who feared he had mislaid something of value, but suspected it might reappear if he only remained motionless enough. He greeted Purbright with rehearsed cheerfulness that wavered like a candle in a draught. "My dear Inspector, your presence is appreciated. The matter is small, embarrassingly small in fact, but it has created a certain murmuring." Purbright removed his hat with polite neutrality. "Murmuring, sir?" The vicar nodded at the choir loft as if it had recently committed a tactless remark. During Vespers, one of the private confession papers was placed upon the rail as usual, confidential, sealed, and meant for my eyes alone. It is now no longer present. "Mislaid," Purbright suggested gently. Reverend Estler brightened, briefly hopeful. "A charitable explanation, yes, though I fear charitable explanations enjoy only limited popularity among our congregation these days." Purbright surveyed the nave. The pews, still faintly perfumed with damp hymnals and elderly wool, offered no hint of conspiracy. Yet a peculiar stiffness in the air suggested that someone, somewhere in the parish, had been rehearsing innocence. "I wonder," Purbright said, "who discovered the absence?" "That would be Mrs. Plimsoll, a vigorous supporter of ritual, though her accuracy improves when recounting events after a suitable interval." Mrs. Plimsoll materialized before she was summoned, as if summoned by ecclesiastical instinct. She greeted Purbright with a sigh of long-suffering virtue. "Inspector, I hardly wish to disturb you with trivialities, but the missing paper, oh, what must people think? I noticed it was gone only because I always admire the way the vicar arranges them. Very precise, most reassuring." Purbright offered a small bow. "And you saw it placed there?" "Indeed I did," she replied, drawing herself up. "Sealed and folded in the regulation manner, though I should never pry. But when I returned after the anthem of devotion, I saw no paper at all. I assumed the vicar had retrieved it. He had not." Her tone conveyed the precise degree of indignation appropriate for a breach of clerical decorum. Serious, but not enough to cancel an upcoming committee meeting. Purbright turned to the choir loft. "Anyone linger up there after the service?" Mrs. Plimsoll gave a delicate shudder. "The choir boys loiter, of course, but only with the usual mischief. Mr. Breamley, the organist, remained, though he seldom notices anything unrelated to octaves." The vicar cleared his throat with pastoral restraint. The confession, as far as I could see before the service, bore no identifying marks. It is meant to be private, naturally, but I suspect the author wished to unburden themselves of some personal guilt or unease. Purbright heard the pause before unease. He also noted that the vicar's gaze drifted toward the south aisle, where the polished memorial tablets looked especially judgmental. "Do you recall," Purbright asked, "whether anyone behaved unusually during the service?" Mrs. Plimsoll inhaled sharply. "Inspector, one must tread carefully, but I did detect a certain stiffness among the parish committee. The sort of stiffness that suggests one is pretending not to have discussed something beforehand." Reverend Estel murmured a prayer-like protest. "Mrs. Plimsoll, please." "I only speak to spare embarrassment," she replied, smiling with the benevolence of one who seldom spares embarrassment. Purbright thanked her and examined the loft more closely. A faint impression on the rail suggested that a paper had indeed lain there recently. The window above allowed a narrow view into the churchyard, where the dusk pressed in with quiet persistence. Nothing else seemed disturbed. When he descended, Reverend Eskel approached him with a confidential murmur. "I fear, Inspector, that the contents may have concerned an internal matter, a misunderstanding within one of our administrative groups. Utterly mundane, of course, if only left alone." Purbright had long noted the Flaxborough instinct to camouflage significance under layers of polite insignificance. The vicar's tone contained the telltale tremor of a man who hoped a subject might die of disinterest before being properly examined. "I shall make a few discreet inquiries," Purbright said. "If the slip reappears, please inform me at once." Mrs. Plimsoll, overhearing, pressed her hands together. "Inspector, I do hope you find it. One cannot have private matters wandering about unattended. People might draw the most inconvenient conclusions." Purbright gave her a measured nod. Indeed, conclusions are often more troublesome than facts. As he left the church, the vestry door creaked with the weary reluctance of a witness about to betray a confidence. The evening light had softened to a faint grey, lending the churchyard an atmosphere of dutiful secrecy. Purbright paused at the gate. Across the street, a window curtain fell back into place with excessive swiftness, an observation neither dramatic nor accidental. Someone had been watching the visitors to St. Mildred's. He adjusted his hat, filed the detail quietly into his thoughts, and walked on. The missing confession might yet prove trivial. But Flaxborough's talent for concealing motives beneath immaculate courtesy suggested otherwise. And the curtain's hurried retreat hinted that the confession's disappearance was known, perhaps anticipated, by more than one respectable parishioner. Inspector Purbright's morning began with the sort of drizzle that encouraged introspection, though rarely honesty. Flaxborough lay under a thin veil of mist that softened its edges without improving its character. The inspector, suitably fortified by modest coffee, set out to speak with those who had attended the Vespers service. His official purpose was clarity, though he suspected reassurance might prove the more needed commodity. His first call was upon Mrs. Brindle, a woman whose natural reserve had been mistaken for humility until repeated observation proved it merely tactical. She greeted him at the door with an air of dutiful hospitality, offering tea before he had fully stepped onto the mat. "I do hope," she said, leading him to the sitting-room with ceremonial steps, "that this is not about anything uncomfortable." Purbright chose a tone he reserved for mild predicaments. "Merely routine inquiries, Mrs. Brindle. We seek only to establish whether anything out of the ordinary occurred." "Out of the ordinary?" She placed the teapot down as if handling a volatile substance. "Inspector, at St. Mildred's, the only extraordinary thing is how very little extraordinary things occur." This statement, delivered with deliberate pleasantness, seemed slightly too well-shaped for casual speech. Purbright allowed it to settle before continuing. "I understand you sat toward the front?" "Indeed. One hears the vicar better and the choir boys less." "And did you notice anyone approaching the choir loft either before or after the anthem?" Mrs. Brindle considered the question with the exaggerated concentration of someone choosing the most virtuous answer. "I may have seen Mr. Delaney, though I could be mistaken. He is one of those men one notices only afterward." Purbright nodded. Mr. Delaney, a retired clerk of unassailable correctness, fit that description admirably. "Did he seem purposeful?" "Oh, Inspector," she replied, stirring her tea though she had added nothing to it. Purpose is something the parish committee prides itself on, even when it has none. This remark appeared to slip out unintentionally. She corrected herself with gentle haste. I only mean that people do take their duties seriously. Purbright thanked her, sensing he had reached the limit of her permissible candour. As he rose to leave, she added, with a breath too small to be quite an accident, I dare say someone will be relieved when this matter is resolved, whoever they may be. The inspector stepped back into the drizzle with the impression that Mrs. Brindle possessed more information than she wished to have. His next visit was to Mr. Delaney himself, who lived in a trim, semi-detached house whose hedge stood clipped with militaristic precision. Delaney opened the door, wearing a cardigan of the same beige authority as his expression. Inspector Purbright, I trust there is no trouble. None at all, Purbright assured him. Just a few inquiries about the Vespers service. Ah. Delaney shifted aside with the faint reluctance of a man granting access to his own tidiness. Well, do come in. I value transparency, Inspector. Very important in committee work. They settled in a room with furniture arranged so symmetrically it seemed apologetic for existing. Purbright began his questions gently. I understand you may have gone toward the choir loft? Delaney blinked, surprised not by the question, but by the accuracy of it. Yes, entirely innocently, I thought I had left my gloves on the pew. I realized my error when I reached the steps. A simple mistake. Quite. I do not linger in choir lofts, Inspector. They are acoustically inconvenient and structurally precarious. Purbright waited, allowing the silence to ferment. Delaney shifted, smoothing an imaginary crease on his trousers. If this concerns the missing paper, I assure you I touched nothing. Purbright watched him for a moment. May I ask, Mr. Delaney, how you knew the paper was missing? Delaney's lips tightened almost invisibly. Mrs. Plimsoll mentioned it. She mentions most things. Indeed, Purbright replied mildly. She is rarely accused of neglect. Quite so, Delaney said, the faintest hint of disapproval creeping into his voice. I would only add, Inspector, that matters left unattended tend to attract speculation, and speculation once encouraged is reluctant to leave. The inspector left with the clear impression that Delaney had not told him everything, though whether through caution or courtesy remained uncertain. Purbright's final call of the morning was at the home of Miss Coppershaw, the parish newsletter editor. She opened the door wearing the optimistic expression of someone who had feared worse callers. "Oh, Inspector, how unexpected! Do excuse the disorder." There was none. Purbright explained his purpose. Miss Coppershaw nodded with modest gravity. I had hoped the matter would soon fade. Truly, the town thrives on half-truths, Inspector, but it rarely digests whole ones. Did anyone speak to you after Vespers? Anyone uncommonly concerned? She hesitated, her fingers worrying the edge of a folded circular. Mr. Breamley, our organist, made a remark I found peculiar. He said, some confessions should remain between oneself and God, not between oneself and godly neighbours. I thought it a rather pointed thing to say. Purbright made a mental note. Pointed remarks often serve a dull purpose, he observed. Miss Coppershaw managed a small, rueful smile. Yes. To warn without admitting. One is warning. The inspector thanked her and stepped back into the soft drizzle which had become a steady misting. Flaxborough's rooftops blurred at the edges as if reluctant to offer definition. On his return toward the station, he passed St. Mildred's. The church stood quiet, its windows catching only the faintest reflection of the damp daylight. Purbright paused, noticing a detail he had missed the evening before. A narrow smudge, finger-shaped and recent, marked the brass handle of the loft door. It was a small thing, easily overlooked by anyone unconcerned with small things. Yet Flaxborough's troubles, he reflected, seldom arrived in larger sizes. He studied the mark a moment longer, then continued on his way, carrying with him the soft but distinct suspicion that someone had been in the loft again, after the service and after the matter had already become public whisper. The minutes of the parish council meeting were, in Flaxborough tradition, both meticulously prepared and strategically uninformative. Inspector Purbright received them from the council clerk, Miss Titheridge, who presented the folder as though handing over a delicate relic whose sanctity must not be disturbed. The inspector, long acquainted with the town's instinct for administrative self-preservation, opened it with the mild curiosity of a man reading a familiar novel whose plot had been rearranged for modest thrills. The minutes were neat, but too neat. Lines ended with improbable symmetry, and the corrections, those faint, powdery erasures, suggested the council had enjoyed a lively debate about what it wished to appear not to have debated. Purbright closed the folder gently. "Most thorough work as always, Miss Titheridge." She coloured slightly. Whether from pride or caution, it was impossible to say. "We do try to maintain clarity, Inspector." "Yes," he murmured. "Clarity often requires a certain amount of polishing." Miss Titheridge's expression flickered, as though she had briefly lost her place in a rehearsed performance. "If something is unclear, sir, I should be glad to elucidate." Purbright thanked her and left the parish office, carrying with him the impression that clarity had been sacrificed early in the drafting process, and that what remained was an earnest attempt to bury the body beneath tasteful shrubbery. His next visit brought him to Councillor Blevins, a man whose civic devotion was exceeded only by his devotion to being seen to possess it. Blevins welcomed Purbright with an air of lofty resignation, suggesting he had anticipated this call and deserved mild credit for doing so. "I suppose," he began, settling into a chair that seemed to have been built exclusively for pronouncements, "that this is about certain unfounded notions circulating in the parish." Purbright chose a pleasantly bland tone. "Notions can be instructive, councillor. They often indicate where facts prefer not to tread." Blevins nodded gravely, as if endorsing a theological stance. "Still, rumours can be harmful. Reputations are fragile things. One must tread gently." "Of course," Purbright said. "And the council minutes? I gather some amendments were necessary." "Purely stylistic," Blevins asserted, smoothing his moustache with judicial care. "Miss Titheridge has a fondness for excessive punctuation. I merely clarified the sense." Purbright did not point out that clarification generally required comment rather than subtraction. "I see, and there was no reference to any internal difficulty concerning the Vespers service?" Blevins looked faintly affronted. Too faintly, Purbright thought, for genuine indignation. "The council concerns itself with governance, Inspector, not gossip." Purbright thanked him and took his leave, noting as he departed that Blevins watched him go with the stiff-lipped composure of a man hoping his past statements would not be revisited. The inspector next sought out Mrs. Halverton, another council member, and one whose contributions were traditionally offered in a tone suggesting both modesty and reluctant omniscience. She opened the door with a softness that implied the world might bruise if handled too firmly. "Oh, Inspector Purbright, do come in. I imagine you're picking through the debris of our last meeting." Purbright smiled. "Debris is perhaps too strong a word." "On the contrary," she replied, pouring tea with careful pastoral symbolism. "It describes us rather well these days, There was a certain tension, I admit. Not over the confession itself, you understand, but over the thought that someone, no one knows who, naturally, might have written something unfortunate. Purbright stirred his tea, though not enough to alter its character. Was there any reference, even oblique, during the meeting? Mrs. Halverton dabbed the corner of her lip with the precision of a woman accustomed to delicate corrections. Only a comment about ensuring our records reflected unity. I think Councillor Merritt said something about avoiding unnecessary memorialization of events better forgotten. The man speaks in embroidered cushions. And everyone agreed? Oh yes, agreement is our strong suit, Inspector. Not unanimity, of course, just the appearance of it. Purbright thanked her, sensing she had reached the boundary beyond which candour might endanger lifelong acquaintance. Back at the station, he laid the council minutes on his desk and compared them to Miss Titheridge's earlier draft, which she had provided with discreet reluctance. The differences were subtle, certain phrases excised, a few lines smoothed, until their meaning dissolved into benevolent vagueness. One particular omission caught his eye, a reference to a pending matter of personal concern raised privately after Sunday's service. The phrase had vanished entirely from the final version. Purbright leaned back, folding his hands. It was a small deletion, but small deletions were Flaxborough's preferred method of crisis management. Better to remove than to explain, better to forget than to record. A tap on the door announced Sergeant Malley, who entered with the vaguely apologetic air of a man who had discovered something yet feared it might prove administratively inconvenient. "Sir, Miss Titheridge sent this over. Said she forgot to include it." He placed a slip of paper on the desk. Purbright lifted it. The writing was Miss Titheridge's tidy script, though less polished than usual, as if written in mild haste. It read, "Regarding the omitted line, Councillor Merritt requested its removal. He said it invited misinterpretation. Please return this note at once." Purbright folded the slip, considering the quiet anxiety visible between its lines. Miss Titheridge was not prone to oversight. If she had omitted a detail, it was because someone had encouraged her to do so, with courtesy, of course, but with unmistakable firmness. He opened the window slightly. The late afternoon air drifted in, tinged with the faint smell of damp grass and concealed intentions. Somewhere between the first draft of the minutes and the final, someone had taken care to remove a reference that might have pointed, however delicately, toward the missing confession. And someone else had immediately grown nervous about that removal the moment Purbright began to ask questions. The inspector placed the slip inside his notebook. It was, after all, the smallest things: an erased line, a hurried correction, a clerk's hesitant admission that tended to reveal where reputations had been delicately rearranged. And Councillor Merritt, a man known for preferring wide statements over precise ones, had suddenly decided that one line invited misinterpretation. Purbright smiled faintly. It was often the fear of interpretation rather than the fact itself that proved most telling. The subcommittee on ecclesiastical harmony occupied in the vicar's administrative hierarchy a position of ceremonial insignificance combined with a surprising ability to agitate its members. Inspector Purbright approached their gathering with the mild curiosity of a man investigating a disturbance caused chiefly by rearranged teacups. The meeting was held in Mrs. Charnock's drawing-room, whose curtains, heavy enough to suppress most scandal, hung at angles suggesting recent, hurried adjustments. 6 members awaited him, each wearing the apologetic stiffness of people determined to appear innocent without having been accused. Mrs. Charnock rose first, her smile tremulous with importance. "Inspector Purbright, we are terribly sorry to intrude upon your schedule. This matter of the missing confession has unsettled our little group. Entirely for spiritual reasons, of course. Purbright inclined his head. Naturally. Harmony, I believe, is your remit. A faint rustle of unease travelled the circle. Mr. Latchford, the subcommittee's nominal vice-chairman, cleared his throat with bureaucratic delicacy. We merely wish to avoid unnecessary alarm, Inspector. Things can so easily be misinterpreted when written anonymously. Or when no longer written at all, Purbright replied. Latchford shifted. Quite. The inspector accepted a cup of tea served by Mrs. Brathmore, whose reputation for discretion was matched only by her enthusiasm for observing the lapses of others. She poured with a reverence that suggested theological symbolism, though her eyes hovered near the inspector's notebook with unmistakable curiosity. "I understand," Purbright began, "that your subcommittee discussed whether the disappearance of the confession should be mentioned officially." Mrs. Charnock responded with the quivering dignity of someone rescuing china from the brink of a shelf. "We prefer not to foster speculation. Some matters are best resolved privately by those involved." "Indeed? And are those involved known to you?" All 6 members stiffened in harmonious simultaneity. Mrs. Brathmore answered first, her smile narrow. "We have no idea whatsoever, Inspector. None. Entirely anonymous, as is proper." Purbright allowed the silence to draw itself out like slowly cooling porridge. Mr. Latchford folded his hands in a gesture of patient mortification. "It is simply," he said, "that certain pastoral concerns, if raised in writing, might reflect regrettable misunderstandings. Misunderstandings which a small town may handle poorly." "Would this concern," Purbright asked, "a misunderstanding currently troubling the committee?" Mrs. Charnock fluttered. "Oh, heavens, no, we are united, absolutely united." She glanced around the room, as if urging unity to reveal itself promptly. Miss Quibbs, who had not spoken until now, broke the silence with the abruptness of a kettle beginning to boil. "There was some talk, purely logistical, about seating arrangements for the choir, but that is hardly the kind of matter one confesses." Mrs. Brathmore sniffed. "Depends who is doing the confessing." This earned her several cautious glances. Purbright sipped his tea, finding its temperature agreeable and its implications slightly tart. "You mentioned wanting to avoid unnecessary alarm. Who precisely expressed that concern first?" A shuffle of feet. Mr. Latchford coughed. Miss Quibbs looked at her lap as though receiving solemn instruction from its folds. Finally, Mrs. Charnock answered. "I may have raised the question, but only because we received, a letter advising restraint." Purbright looked mildly interested. "A letter?" "Anonymously delivered," she added quickly. "It suggested that public discussion would do more harm than good." "May I see it?" Mrs. Charnock exchanged an uneasy glance with Latchford before rising to fetch a folder from a writing desk. She handed Purbright a single sheet, typed, unsigned, and composed with the overly considerate tone of someone wishing to sound moral without the inconvenience of being persuasive. The message read, "It would be prudent to maintain discretion regarding last Sunday's expression of personal concern. The parish must not be distressed by matters which are best resolved quietly." Purbright noted the paper's smoothness. "You received this when?" "The morning after Vespers," Latchford said. "Slipped under the door. No envelope." "Interesting." Miss Quibbs leaned forward. "Do you think, Inspector, that the writer of the confession also wrote the letter?" Purbright considered the possibility. Those wishing to confess usually favour more direct channels. Anonymous discouragement tends to come from those wishing to prevent confession. A ripple ran through the room, like a wind passing over tightly mown grass. Mrs. Brathmore exhaled too sharply, to be accidental. "I cannot see why anyone would feel threatened by such a thing," she said, her tone so defensive it seemed to assume the presence of hidden accusations. Purbright did not contradict her. Instead, he turned the letter over and examined the indentation left on its reverse, faint, diagonal, suggestive of something written above it, perhaps on a pad. A fragment of another message, unintentionally pressed into the paper. He held it to the light. One word seemed barely clear enough to surface: revise. The subcommittee watched him with an anxious unanimity that, had their purpose truly been harmony, might have made them proud. "I should like," Purbright said, "to keep this letter for the moment." No one protested. That in itself was informative. He thanked them for their cooperation, which they accepted with the relief of children excused from compulsory recitation, and let himself out. The afternoon light had thickened. The sky offered the same muted disapproval as the committee behind him. Halfway down the street, Purbright paused beneath a lamp-post. The indentation on the back of the anonymous letter had been faint but unmistakable. The pressure marks were diagonal, not from handwriting, but from an object placed carelessly atop it. A notebook corner, a council notebook. He folded the sheet and placed it inside his coat, the small clue settling like a whisper. Someone on the parish council had not only known of the confession, but taken steps to ensure it did not see sunlight. And they had done it with perfect, polished politeness. The Tuesday meeting of the All Saints Parish Improvements Committee had never been accused of undue urgency, nor indeed of any measurable progress. Its members preferred deliberation that resembled a genteel form of stasis. Yet on this particular morning, the air in the vestry hall seemed to thicken with a faint, defensive caution, as though each participant feared contributing anything that might later be quoted against them. Inspector Purbright's appearance at the door merely intensified this effect. He entered with that stiff politeness of his which always made people feel they might already be suspected of something unbecoming. Mrs. Abelston, who chaired the committee by what was essentially force of longevity, greeted him with a smile that sought to convey gratitude, bewilderment, and disapproval in equal measure. "Inspector," she said, "we were not expecting visitors of the professional variety, though of course you are most welcome, provided nothing is amiss." "Nothing is amiss," Purbright replied, "though something may be misplaced." He took a seat with the sort of quiet determination that indicated he had no intention of leaving quickly. The committee's members, 7 pillars of civic restraint, exchanged looks suggesting that this remark, however vague, was already too dramatic for their liking. Purbright explained, with a mildness bordering on courteous apology, that he wished to inquire about the missing Vespers confession received by Reverend Melliton, which had apparently vanished between the vestry desk and the vicarage wastebasket. The description of this document produced an array of reactions. Mrs. Abelstone's eyelids fluttered in moral alarm. Mr. Worsfold, church treasurer, examined his fingernails as though checking them for defamatory implications, and Mrs. Dering, the newsletter editor, produced a small cough resembling the punctuation of a guilty footnote. "What I hope to understand," Purbright continued, "is whether any member of this committee visited the church on Thursday afternoon. I gather there was some informal activity regarding new hymn board placements. This harmless topic should have eased them, but instead the very word visited appeared to wrinkle their sense of communal propriety." Mr. Worsfold cleared his throat. "I may have stepped in briefly," he said, in a tone that suggested he might as well confess to treason as admit to entering a church out of scheduled hours. Merely to check whether the offertory figures had been recorded properly. Mrs. Dering interjected that she had been present too, but solely to return a borrowed stapler, an errand she described with such solemnity that one might have assumed the device carried diplomatic classification. Both of them assured Purbright almost simultaneously that they had touched nothing resembling a letter. The inspector, who had mastered the art of letting silence do the work of pointed questioning, allowed the quiet to settle until Mrs. Ableston, oppressed by it, began speaking in the flustered manner of one who feels responsible for the general conduct of everyone in the district. "Inspector, if a confession has indeed gone astray, I am certain it must be the result of some administrative oversight. Our parish is not accustomed to clandestine behaviour, at least not of the malicious type." "I should hope not," Purbright replied, though in a tone that hinted he would not be astonished if the parish proved an exception. He asked a few small questions about locked drawers and cleaning staff schedules, taking notes with the unhurried precision that made people wonder how many pages he might already have filled about them. Every committee member attempted to look calm, but their expressions, tight smiles, rigid posture, ostentatious interest in their cups of weak parish tea, betrayed the discomfort of people who felt that privacy as a concept was currently under siege. Mrs. Dering, recovering somewhat, mentioned the newsletter's upcoming issue and asked whether the police might prefer a brief notice encouraging parishioners to turn in any misplaced correspondence they might find. Purbright thanked her, but suggested this would do more to raise alarm than compliance. He also suspected that any reader moved to deliver such a document would refrain from doing so publicly. There followed a digression on the wording of a poster advertising the spring social, which the committee debated with a gravity that clearly served as a protective diversion from the topic of missing confessions. Purbright observed them while maintaining the expression of a man dutifully tolerating ceremonial distractions. He noted especially Mrs. Ableston's persistent glances toward the hall cupboard, as though praying it would not be opened by anyone, particularly by him. Eventually, with no further questions to pose, Purbright rose, offering a courteous nod. "Thank you. If any member recalls a small detail, perhaps insignificant at the time, I would be grateful to hear it." He made his way to the door unhurried, but paused when he noticed a faint smear of dust along the bottom edge of the cupboard Mrs. Ableston had watched so protectively. It suggested recent movement, perhaps hurriedly executed. Purbright did not examine it closely. He merely observed, tucked the thought away, and departed with a polite farewell. Behind him the room exhaled in collective relief. Yet Mrs. Ableston's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the minutes folder. She seemed acutely aware that whatever lay behind that cupboard door had not escaped the inspector's notice, even if he had been too tactful to mention it. The tremor, slight but unmistakable, was hint enough. The cupboard, it seemed, would merit a return visit. The vicarage, at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday, gave the impression of a house attempting to live up to expectations it had never agreed to. Its corridors smelled faintly of lavender polish and quiet administrative worry. Reverend Melliton, a man whose habitual diffidence had lately acquired an edge of fretful calculation, ushered Inspector Purbright into the sitting-room with an apologetic gesture that suggested even the furniture might withhold cooperation. The inspector seated himself with the kind of deliberate neutrality that often unsettled clergymen more than outright suspicion. "I fear," Melliton began, smoothing his cassock in slow circular motions, "that my earlier description of events may have lacked a certain coherence. One does not always recall the mundane with precision, and I should hate to mislead the authorities through mere untidiness of memory." "Quite understood," Purbright replied. "Still, small irregularities in recollection are often more telling than confident narratives." His tone carried no rebuke, merely the quiet implication that disorder could be informative. The vicar blanched faintly at that and produced a folder of drafts, sermons, circulars, and parish notices, all handwritten with ritualistic care. He placed them on the low table with the solemnity of someone surrendering evidence against himself, though Purbright had asked only to understand the process by which documents passed through the vicarage. The inspector leafed through them politely. Several bore cross-outs and marginalia that revealed the vicar's habitual struggle to balance firmness with charity in matters of parish discipline. One page, however, arrested his attention, not through its content, but its absence of it. Where text had once been, only faint impressions remained, as though something had been written and later removed with a conscientious thoroughness that did not quite erase its ghost. "You revise frequently," Purbright observed. "Endlessly," Melliton sighed. "A sermon is never truly finished, only abandoned, rather like the annual stewardship appeal, though with fewer complaints." He offered a thin smile intended to signal composure, but his eyes betrayed the mild panic of a man who feared every word might be construed as a confession of something else entirely. Purbright turned another page and noted without comment that several sheets had been reshuffled recently. A faint trace of dried mud along the top corner suggested the folder had at some point been placed on the floor. An odd choice for a man as habitually orderly as Melliton. Yet the inspector confined his remarks to innocuous questions about locking routines, and who else might have had access to the vestry on the fateful Thursday. The vicar answered each question with the prudence of someone navigating a conversational minefield. He mentioned Mrs. Dering's brief visit, Mr. Worsfold's habitual wanderings, and the organist's unfortunate tendency to appear unannounced in search of misplaced sheet music. Each person's presence, though innocent in his telling, seemed to burden Melliton with its own atmospheric weight, as though their very proximity to the missing confession compromised his sense of clerical order. Tea arrived, carried in by Mrs. Melliton, who possessed a quiet competence that suggested long practice in managing her husband's anxieties. She greeted Purbright kindly, but with the faint guardedness of someone who had seen the inspector's visits precede periods of considerable parish unrest. Her glance drifted momentarily to the folder of drafts, though she quickly averted her eyes, as if fearful that looking too intently might imply knowledge she did not wish to claim. "Thank you, Mrs. Melliton," Purbright said. "Always a pleasure to intrude upon your calm." "Calm," she remarked, with a small smile lacking any warmth, "is sometimes a matter of performance rather than circumstance." Then, with the efficient retreat of one accustomed to leaving conversations at the right moment, she disappeared down the hall. Purbright took a slow sip of tea and placed his cup down with care. "You mentioned earlier," he said, "that the confession appeared suddenly in your letter pile without indication of how it arrived." "Yes," Melliton replied, voice thinning. "I assumed it had been slipped through the box. Yet the handwriting was too deliberate, as though written by someone rehearsing sincerity." "That is an interesting observation," the inspector said mildly. "Did anything strike you as inconsistent with the tone of your usual correspondence?" Melliton hesitated so long that Purbright did not need an answer. Hesitation, in his experience, revealed as much as speech. But eventually the vicar admitted in a low voice that the phrasing carried a peculiar self-awareness, as if the writer wished the burden of their guilt to be admired rather than absolved. The inspector made no remark, though privately he considered that such theatrical remorse seldom accompanied genuine wrongdoing. It sounded more like the handiwork of someone orchestrating impressions, perhaps hoping the confession would be found by exactly the person whose discretion might be counted on. A soft knock interrupted them, followed by the entrance of Mr. Elwood, the curate, whose diffident courtesy made Melliton appear almost authoritative by comparison. Elwood apologized profusely for interrupting, but claimed the vicarage printer had once again devoured the weekly prayer sheet. Melliton rose to deal with it, leaving Purbright momentarily alone with the curate. Elwood stood awkwardly, hands loosely clasped. "I gather," he said with tentative decorum, "that something has gone astray." "One might say so," Purbright responded. The curate nodded, perhaps relieved by the vagueness, yet the inspector noticed a small ink stain on Elwood's cuff, fresh, not yet fully dried. It seemed inconsistent with his explanation of dealing solely with the printer. Purbright did not comment, but when Melliton returned, shepherding Elwood out to address the paper jam, the inspector's gaze drifted once more to the faint impressions on the erased sheet. When he finally departed the vicarage, he carried with him not answers, but a quietly accumulating texture of inconsistencies. Nothing so bold as evidence, just a faint suspicion that drafts, stains and hesitant recollections were pieces of some larger, more self-conscious arrangement. And as he stepped through the garden gate, he noticed the wastebasket outside the vicarage door, empty, freshly lined, and yet bearing a faint residue of shredded paper that did not match the usual household refuse. It was not proof, but it was enough to ask the next question. Miss Frobisher lived in the sort of orderly cottage that gave the impression of having submitted long ago to her regime of punctual dusting and unrelenting moral tidiness. Her curtains possessed the rigid drape of fabric afraid to crease in her presence, and the hall rug had never once dared to shift from its mathematically precise alignment. It was into this domain that Inspector Purbright stepped, following an invitation extended in the crisp, faintly apprehensive tone of someone who feared any failure to comply might itself appear incriminating. Miss Frobisher greeted him with a smile so tense it resembled an apology issued on behalf of the entire street. "I trust this is not an inconvenient moment," Purbright said, though it was clear that any moment for Miss Frobisher was inconvenient if it threatened the tranquillity of her household routine. "Not at all, Inspector. I had merely been preparing my correspondence, which must go out with the evening post. Matters of subscription reminders," she added, as though clarifying that her letters were wholly innocent of personal sentiment. Purbright took a seat in the narrow drawing-room. The chair was firm enough to serve as penance for anyone tempted to linger excessively. He noted the tidy stacks of envelopes on the writing desk, addresses written in small, disciplined script. A blotter, a nearly empty inkwell, and a small pile of discarded drafts completed the scene. Without overtly staring, he noticed that several crumpled pages bore faint horizontal tears, as though the writer had thought better of certain phrases too late in the process. "I wish to ask," Purbright began, "about your visit to the church on Thursday. You were seen entering around 4:30. Miss Frobisher blinked with a sort of delicate alarm. "Entirely in my capacity as Secretary of the Charity Subcommittee. I left a note for Reverend Melliton regarding the revised donation ledger. The vicar was not present, so I placed it on the vestry desk. Quite properly," she added, in a manner that implied the note had been chaperoned by her own respectability. "Did you notice any other correspondence on the desk at the time?" Her fingers knitted themselves together with precise tension. "Only a few envelopes. I did not examine them. It would be inappropriate to speculate on their contents." She spoke so firmly that Purbright suspected she had speculated at length, but would not risk revealing the direction of such thoughts. He shifted his gaze to the writing desk. "You are preparing a considerable number of letters." "Merely routine," she insisted. "I maintain records for 3 societies. There is rarely a quiet week." Her lips pursed. People are often lax in replying unless firmly prompted. Purbright nodded, letting a silence gather. Miss Frobisher, like most who feared implication, seemed compelled to fill it. "Of course, I do sometimes receive confidential matters," she acknowledged reluctantly. but I treat all communications with strict propriety. Nothing leaves this house unless intended. I imagine you discard many drafts, Purbright said. A regrettable necessity. Accuracy is paramount. He stood and walked, slowly, politely, to the writing desk. He did not touch anything, yet his presence beside the blotter seemed to unnerve her into subtle confession. I did write a note to the vicar last week that I later tore up, she admitted, her voice an octave lighter than her usual severity. I felt my tone insufficiently charitable. One must avoid appearing officious. Indeed, Purbright replied. Did that note concern the donation ledger? Indirectly. She hesitated, then added, It concerned the conduct of one committee member. I believed it best not to pursue the matter. Purbright's expression did not alter, though the statement registered as one of the many small fractures in the polite veneer he had observed across the parish. He asked who the member was. Miss Frobisher drew herself upright. Mrs. Derring? She has of late taken an unwarranted interest in parish correspondence. I felt the vicar should be made aware, but upon reflection I feared my remark might be interpreted as petty. She paused. I tore it up and disposed of it immediately. Purbright let this admission settle. The faint distress in her tone suggested that Miss Frobisher feared her discarded remark might, by some administrative sorcery, be retrieved and held against her. Do you often tear pages horizontally? He asked lightly. Her eyes widened. Oh, well, yes. It seems neater. He did not contradict her, though he had observed the remnants in her wastebasket were torn vertically. A small inconsistency, but one that carried the weight of deliberate revision. The inspector thanked her and prepared to leave. Yet, as she escorted him to the door, Miss Frobisher paused. Her gaze drifted toward the mantel, where a small, decorative box sat slightly ajar. She closed it quickly as though suddenly remembering something she preferred not to acknowledge. Purbright noticed the movement but made no comment beyond a courteous nod. You have been very helpful, he said. I hope so, she replied, sounding unconvinced. Outside, the afternoon air felt noticeably freer than the stifled, overmanaged atmosphere of Miss Frobisher's cottage. Purbright paused by the garden gate and allowed himself a small consideration of the facts. The letters, the torn drafts, the uncharacteristic anxiety, none amounted to evidence, yet each suggested that Miss Frobisher knew more about parish correspondence than she wished to disclose. But what held his attention most was that fleeting gesture toward the mantel box. It had been small, instinctive, far too quick for a woman accustomed to deliberation. He made a note to return. The box, he suspected, contained something she had not yet decided how to explain. The church treasurer's house enjoyed a reputation for immaculate bookkeeping long before its proprietor achieved the same distinction. Mr. Worsfold, by temperament and profession, lived in submission to columns, ledgers, and the quiet reassurance of numbers that behaved themselves. His front room, where Inspector Purbright was now invited to sit, communicated this preference through its orderly stacks of financial records and the faint yet persistent scent of ink. The inspector, who understood the communicative value of domestic landscapes, took in the scene with polite neutrality, though he registered the small discrepancies: a ledger placed slightly askew, a blotter not quite aligned. That suggested Mr. Worsfold's calm was presently under strain. I trust this is merely a routine inquiry, Worsfold said, offering a cup of tea, in a manner that implied any deviation from routine would be most unwelcome. His thin lips attempted a smile, but did not quite succeed in supporting it. Routine, yes, Purbright replied, but routine does not preclude importance. He accepted the tea, noting that Worsfold's hand trembled slightly as he placed the cup upon its saucer. The treasurer cleared his throat with the precision of someone rehearsing propriety. "I understand," he said, "that something has gone missing. The vicar mentioned it only vaguely. I tend not to involve myself in pastoral matters." "That is often a prudent stance," Purbright said mildly. "Yet the vestry, where this correspondence was left, is a space used by several committee members, including yourself." Worsfold's reaction was a subtle stiffening of posture, as though a column of numbers had suddenly ceased to balance. "Yes, well, I do occasionally enter the vestry, purely for financial oversight." Purbright did not inquire what financial oversight might be required in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. Instead, he sipped his tea, allowing the silence to accumulate a fine layer of expectation. Worsfold, like most who feared misinterpretation, soon surrendered. "I did go in briefly that day," he said, "to check whether the offertory envelopes had been collected. People are shockingly careless with them. I have found them under hymnals, behind flower vases, often opened, which is quite improper." "Did you see anything else on the desk?" Purbright asked. "But a few papers, perhaps. I did not examine them. I do not pry into other people's matters." The hesitation stretched slightly longer than intended, and Purbright detected a faint blush at the treasurer's collar. It suggested, without confirming, that Worsfold occasionally pried quite thoroughly. The inspector placed his cup down and nodded toward the nearest ledger. "Is this week's accounting complete?" "Yes," Worsfold said quickly, "though I may need to make a small amendment. An entry was misplaced." He reached for the ledger, but his hand faltered, as though reconsidering the motion under the inspector's observation. "Only an administrative oversight," he insisted. Purbright allowed himself the faintest inclination of his head. "Oversights happen. One must merely understand their origin." He rose and walked, with the politeness of a man admiring architecture, to the bookshelf where several older ledgers stood. Their arrangement was precise, yet one volume protruded slightly. Purbright's hand hovered near it, but did not touch. "You have quite a system," he remarked. "A necessary one," Worsfold replied, though his voice carried the urgency of someone eager to reassert control over a conversation that had drifted too near areas of discomfort. The inspector turned back toward the table. His attention settled on a single slip of paper tucked beneath a blotter. A corner protruded, revealing the faint suggestion of handwriting. Worsfold noticed his glance and quickly placed a ledger over the blotter, a gesture so clumsy that it might as well have been a confession. "A note from the vicar," Worsfold explained, perhaps too quickly. "Entirely mundane." "Of course," Purbright said. "I would not wish to intrude upon your administrative privacy." The statement, though perfectly polite, caused Worsfold's face to tighten. Privacy as a concept lay at the heart of the matter. The treasurer's relationship with information seemed not merely custodial, but strategic. Purbright resumed his seat, adopting an expression that invited elaboration. "It was only," Worsfold continued, "a reminder about the upcoming audit, nothing of consequence." "I find most reminders have some consequence," the inspector observed. Worsfold did not reply. Instead, he produced a small, unnecessary cough and reached for a different ledger, one containing, Purbright guessed, nothing remotely relevant except as a shield. The inspector watched him leaf through the pages with such exaggerated purpose that it became clear he wished to avoid further scrutiny. After a moment, Purbright asked, "Do you recall whether anyone else entered the vestry during your visit?" "Miss Frobisher left just as I arrived," Worsfold said. "She seemed unsettled, though one hesitates to speculate. She is a woman of such exacting principles." "Principles often produce unrest," Purbright said quietly. Worsfold blinked, uncertain whether this was a general observation or a carefully placed implication. He shifted in his chair. "I cannot imagine she would involve herself in anything improper. She keeps impeccable records." "As do you," Purbright said, allowing the compliment to settle with ambiguous weight. The treasurer, hearing in it a note he could not quite interpret, offered a second cough, more strained than the first. "Inspector," he said, "I do hope this matter is resolved quickly. The parish thrives on stability." "So I have observed," Purbright replied. He rose, thanked Worsfold for his hospitality, and made his way to the hallway. As he approached the door, something caught his eye. A small scrap of paper wedged beneath the umbrella stand. It bore a torn edge, horizontal, irregular. Purbright did not stoop to retrieve it. Instead, he adjusted his coat cuffs with deliberate calm. "Good afternoon, Mr. Worsfold." The treasurer nodded, though his expression suggested that afternoon was unlikely to be good for anyone. Outside, Purbright paused at the gate. The torn slip beneath the umbrella stand, the hidden note beneath the blotter, the altered ledger, all minor, all trivial, all quietly unconvincing. He did not yet know whether Worsfold had seen the missing confession, but he knew one thing with certainty. Someone in the parish was very busy amending the past. The church at mid-morning possessed the unconvincing stillness of a building trying too hard to appear innocent. Dust motes drifted in disciplined formation through the narrow beams of stained glass light, while the faint smell of hymn-book leather lingered like an old argument not quite resolved. Inspector Purbright entered with the careful tread of a man equally unwilling to disturb the peace and entirely convinced it was artificial. He made his way toward the choir loft, where the organist, Mr. Penwell, was engaged in what could generously be described as practice, and less generously as an ongoing personal disagreement with the instrument. Penwell stopped playing the moment he saw the inspector. "Ah, I imagine you're here about that unfortunate matter." His tone suggested that misfortune, in his view, was something best handled by other people. "In part," Purbright replied, "but I'm also interested in the choir loft itself. One learns a great deal from the vantage points people choose." Penwell blinked at this, either perplexed or unwilling to concede that he chose the loft for anything other than acoustics. "I do spend considerable time up here. The organ requires vigilance." "So I gather," Purbright said, glancing at the array of scattered sheet music. Several pages appeared recently shuffled, and one, the corner folded back with suspicious deliberation, caught his eye. "I understand," he continued, "that the choir rehearsed here last Thursday evening?" Penwell nodded. "A thin showing, I'm afraid. People claim to value sacred music, but only within the limits of their convenience." "Who attended?" "Oh, the usual assortment. Miss Frobisher, who sings as though apologizing for the intrusion of her own voice. Young Michael Rowe, though he left early on account of some scholastic emergency. And Mrs. Dering, who insists on bringing suggestions for hymns more suited to her newsletter than the liturgy." "And did you remain after they departed?" Penwell hesitated, which in itself felt clarifying. "Only briefly," he admitted, "to restore order to the music. Some of them leave pages in deplorable conditions." Purbright nodded, not to agree, but to encourage disclosure. "While you were restoring order, did you come across any documents that seemed out of place? A letter, perhaps?" "No," Penwell answered with excessive firmness. "Nothing whatsoever. If there had been a letter, I should certainly have noticed. One tries to maintain standards." The inspector walked slowly along the loft rail, noting the vantage it offered of the vestry door below. It was the sort of location from which a discreet observer or a cautious opportunist might watch comings and goings without being easily seen. Penwell's expression tightened as he realized what the inspector was observing. "I assure you," he said, "I have no interest in parish gossip." "Of course not," Purbright replied, "though I find gossip is rarely inhibited by a lack of interest." The organist flushed faintly and busied himself aligning a stack of sheet music. Purbright watched him, noting how he kept one page partly concealed beneath the others, as though forgetting that concealment merely changed the nature of attention rather than eliminating it. He did not ask to see it. People revealed more by what they avoided showing. "Tell me," he said, "did you hear movement in the church after rehearsal ended?" Penwell glanced downward toward the nave. "I may have heard someone enter or leave. Acoustics are uncertain. The roof plays tricks with echoes." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Echoes often tell us more about the original sound than the sound itself." Penwell appeared unsure whether this was insight or insinuation. He chose, prudently, not to pursue clarification. A faint scrape from the far end of the loft drew the inspector's attention. He walked toward it and found a small wooden stool pushed partly out of place, as though someone had recently stood upon it. Beside it lay a single, narrow ribbon of torn paper, far smaller than any sheet music. He bent slightly to inspect it without touching. The fragment bore the faint remnants of handwriting. Not enough to read, merely enough to suggest its origin as something more confidential than choral arrangements. Penwell cleared his throat. "The choir boys can be careless," he said quickly, "always dropping things." "This does not look like their usual handiwork," Purbright observed. The organist's posture grew stiff and defensive. "If you imply I had anything to do with that missing document—" "I imply nothing," the inspector said calmly. "I merely observe." Penwell closed the organ lid with unnecessary precision. "I should like to return to my work, Inspector. Music requires concentration." "So do investigations," Purbright replied. He walked down from the loft, his steps echoing faintly, though not faintly enough to prevent Penwell from hearing and worrying about every one of them. At the base of the steps, Purbright paused and looked again toward the vestry. The door was closed, but there was a subtle indentation in the carpet just outside it, a temporary mark the shape of a stool leg or narrow chair foot. Not enough to identify, merely enough to suggest that someone had moved furniture recently. The inspector always trusted disturbances. People could explain their words endlessly, but they rarely managed to align their surroundings with the same precision. As he stepped into the aisle, he passed the hymn board. A new number had been left crookedly inserted, its card bent. It was an ordinary detail, yet its placement seemed somehow deliberate. Too careless for Miss Frobisher, too neat for Penwell, too recent to be accidental. Purbright paused. The bent hymn card, like the torn ribbon in the loft and the shifted stool, belonged to a pattern he did not yet understand. But someone, somewhere in this church, had left behind a fragment of their unease. The parish council convened at precisely 2:30 in the committee room, a space whose wood panelling bore the faint patina of long-standing deliberation and the slightly sharper scent of varnish, attempting to mask generations of resigned boredom. Inspector Purbright arrived just after the appointed hour, noting the mild disorder, chairs not quite aligned, one pen lying sideways on the secretary's desk. He observed it without comment. Such details were usually more revealing than any declaration. The council members, each seated with the practiced air of people who had long ago mastered the art of appearing both attentive and unaccusatory, acknowledged him with nods that carried a trace of rehearsed civility. Mrs. Abbleston, chairwoman by tenure and a self-assigned moral compass, spoke first. "Inspector Purbright, you are most welcome, though I confess the agenda contains little of substance. We are gathered, as always, to maintain the orderliness of parish affairs. Her tone suggested pride in futility, and yet beneath it lurked a faint anxiety. "I understand," Purbright replied, "that last Thursday's meeting has occasioned some concern, particularly regarding the missing Vespers confession." A subtle shift occurred across the table. Several members straightened imperceptibly, pens lifted slightly, as though prepared to record a declaration they were simultaneously disinclined to make. Mr. Latchford, the vice-chairman, cleared his throat with mild theatricality. "We are a community of careful people, Inspector. Misunderstandings are always regrettable, yet the Council strives to present a unified front. That is our duty." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Unified fronts, however, can sometimes conceal minor disturbances." Mrs. Dering, editor of the Parish newsletter, raised a cautious hand. "It is true that some correspondence has been difficult to trace, but one must bear in mind the importance of confidentiality. To air certain matters would unsettle the parish unnecessarily." Her eyes flicked momentarily toward the corner where the minutes were kept, suggesting that she had an interest in their contents beyond what she admitted. Purbright inclined his head without comment. "Confidentiality is, of course, a virtue," he said, "yet it does not always preclude observation." He allowed his gaze to linger on the folded sheet of paper Miss Titheridge had previously offered him, still unobtrusively placed in his notebook. Its faint impression, visible only upon close inspection, suggested intervention, small, deliberate, and elegantly disguised. Mrs. Abbleston, eager to reassure, began to read aloud the last section of the council minutes. She emphasized the unity and propriety of the members, highlighting minor clerical corrections and omitting, with careful discretion, any mention of the private matter raised during Vespers. Purbright listened, noting which phrases were reinforced and which had been quietly excised. The omission was deliberate, intended to preserve appearances. He made no note aloud. His pen rested in polite neutrality. "I should like to understand," he said finally, "whether any members of the council took it upon themselves to rearrange or remove correspondence from the vestry after last week's service." A subtle tension rippled through the room. Mr. Worsfold shifted, glancing at his ledger, as if seeking evidence of his own meticulous propriety. Miss Quibbs, committee secretary, adjusted her spectacles nervously. "No one, Inspector," she said, her voice firm but slightly strained, "engaged in such activity without unanimous consent. We are all careful to act within our remit." Purbright allowed a beat of silence to settle. It was, in his experience, in the spaces between assurances that truth often drifted. He noticed Mrs. Abblestone's hand tremble slightly as she smoothed a paper that had already been excessively smoothed. The gesture was almost imperceptible, but it suggested an internal disquiet she did not wish to acknowledge aloud. "And yet," he said, "the document itself did not remain in place. It vanished from the vestry. That is a fact." Heads tilted, a faint rustle of papers followed, and the council, collectively, seemed to consider the implications. No one denied the occurrence, but no one volunteered explanation. Silence, measured and polite, filled the room like a cushion. Purbright, who had mastered the gentle art of letting tension speak for itself, waited. Miss Dering's voice, careful and low, broke the quiet. "Perhaps it was removed inadvertently. There are many hands in the parish. Cleaning staff, committee members. Mistakes can happen without malice." "Of course," Purbright agreed. "Yet the particular placement and disappearance of this document suggests deliberation. Someone may have wished to preserve reputations rather than truth." He paused, letting the idea settle. "One wonders whether the act itself, discreet though it may have been, carried an implicit message." The council shifted in unison. Mr. Latchford's expression betrayed a flicker of discomfort. Mrs. Quibbs busied herself with minute adjustments to her papers, and Mrs. Abelstone cleared her throat as though the room might be restored to decorum by the mere effort of her voice. Purbright rose, preparing to leave. "I thank you for your cooperation," he said. "The details you have provided are most informative. I shall, of course, continue my inquiries with the same discretion I hope you have exercised." At the door, he paused, glancing back. His gaze swept the council, noting the subtle exchanges, the small nods, the micro-pauses, the faint blush of acknowledgement, and the unspoken hierarchy of who had knowledge, who had acted, and who had observed without intervention. It was enough, for the moment, to know that something lay just beneath the surface, unarticulated but tangible. Outside, he stepped onto the parish green. The afternoon was mild, the light slanting across the low rooftops of Flaxborough. As he walked toward the station, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had heard what was said and what was deliberately withheld. Yet one small question lingered, like a faint echo in a silent nave. Among the council members who had the most to protect, and how far would they go to ensure that the missing confession remained invisible? Purbright adjusted his coat and continued down the path, his mind cataloguing gestures, words, and omissions with the precision of a librarian tending to delicate manuscripts. One day soon, he reflected, even the most carefully polished reputations would have to account for the faint disturbances left behind. And in the orderly rows of hedges and rooftops, a small shadow of movement, easily mistaken for a passerby, seemed to acknowledge that the parish's secrets were not as neatly contained as its minutes claimed,